The snowflakes were not gentle flakes, they were shards of ice driven by a wind that screamed down from the Iron Peak Mountains, seeking any exposed flesh to bite. The wagon rattled violently over the frozen ruts of the trail, the wheels groaning in protest against the unforgiving earth. My Lin sat rigid on the splintered wooden bench, her fingers turning white where she gripped the side of the buckboard. She wore a padded cotton cheongsam of deep indigo, insufficient for this brutal climate, though she had wrapped a vibrant red woolen scarf, her only piece of true warmth, tightly around her neck and lower face. The valley ahead did not look like a place of promise. It looked like the throat of a beast, white and jagged, waiting to swallow her whole. Behind her, the last traces of civilization had vanished hours ago into the swirling white dust. The letter from the broker in San Francisco had been terse, a transaction rather than an introduction. Debt settled. Position secured. Domestic assistance required for Mr. Jericho Thorne, near Deadwood. 3 children. Departure immediate. My Lin was 19, old enough to know that in this strange, hostile land, a Chinese girl with no family was treated with either suspicion or disdain. She was old enough to know that being sent to the remote territory of the Dakotas wasn't an opportunity, it was a sentence. The driver, a hunched man named Abernathy with a beard crusted in ice, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the pristine snow. He hadn't spoken to her for 50 miles, but as the silhouette of a ridge appeared, he finally cleared his throat. "You know who he is, don't you?" Abernathy shouted over the wind, not looking at her. My Lin tightened her red scarf. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her English accented but precise. Abernathy let out a harsh, dry chuckle that sounded like cracking wood. "Mr. Thorne. That's rich. Folks round here don't call him Mr. They call him the Reaper of the Ridge. A gunslinger, missy. The kind that put men in the ground before breakfast. You watch yourself. That man has more ghosts in his house than furniture." My Lin didn't respond. She simply stared at the horizon, trying to imagine what kind of man lived at the edge of the world with 3 motherless children. A desperate one, surely. Or perhaps a monster hiding from his sins. The ranch emerged from the white oat slowly, like a scar on the landscape. It was not the prosperous estate she had hoping for. The barn leaned precariously to the left, its wood grey and weathered, looking as though a strong sneeze would topple it. The fences were jagged lines of rot, held together by barbed wire and sheer stubbornness. The main house was a grim 2-story structure of dark timber, imposing and joyless. A porch wrapped around the front, but the steps looked treacherous under the drift of snow. The wagon halted with a jerk. My Lin climbed down before Abernathy could offer a hand he clearly didn't want to give. Her silk slippers, reinforced with leather soles she had sewn herself, crunched into the snow. She grabbed her single canvas bag, shivering as the cold instantly penetrated her coat. The front door didn't open. It stood like a barrier. She walked to the porch, the wood groaning under her slight weight, and raised a hand to knock. Before her knuckles could graze the wood, the door was yanked inward. He filled the doorway, blocking out the dim light from the interior. Jericho Thorne was a mountain of a man, tall and lean with the coiled tension of a wolf. He wore a heavy shearling coat left open to reveal a gun belt slung low on his hips, the leather worn smooth near the holster. His face was a map of hard living, scars interrupting the stubble on his jaw, eyes the color of flint, cold and assessing. He didn't look like a father. He looked like a weapon that had been left out in the rain. "You the girl?" His voice was a low gravel rumble, vibrating with impatience. "I am My Lin," she said, lifting her chin. She refused to cower, though every instinct screamed at her to run. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the red scarf and the foreign cut of her dress. He didn't sneer, but he didn't smile. "Small," he muttered. "Come in before you freeze the hall." He stepped aside. My Lin stepped over the threshold, leaving the howling wind behind. The house smelled of stale coffee, wood smoke, and gun oil. The front room was sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the fire burning low and struggling against the draft. A rough-hewn table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Dust motes danced in the gloom, and there was a heavy, suffocating silence that felt purposeful. 3 shadows detached themselves from the corners of the room. "This is the brood," Jericho said, waving a dismissive hand. The oldest was a girl of about 12, standing with her arms crossed and a hunting knife sheathed at her belt. She had her father's flinty eyes and a tangle of dark hair that looked like it had never seen a comb. This was Cassidy. Beside her was a boy of 8, Tate, who vibrated with nervous energy, his hands twitching near his pockets. Peeking out from behind the sofa was the youngest, a girl no older than 6, clutching a doll made of tied rags. This was Ivy. "I am pleased to meet you," Mylin said, bowing her head slightly. Cassidy stared at her with open hostility. "We don't need a nursemaid. Especially not a foreigner." "Cassidy," Jericho warned, though his tone lacked true heat. "Mind your tongue. She looks like she'll break if the wind blows," Cassidy spat, turning her back. "Tate. Ivy. This is Mylin," Jericho continued, ignoring his eldest. "She's here to keep this house from falling down around our ears. You will listen to her." Tate kicked the floorboards. Ivy buried her face in her rag doll. Jericho turned back to Mylin. "Upper floor, second door on the left. It has a lock. I suggest you use it." Mylin blinked. "A lock? This ain't a nursery, Miss Lin. It's a fort. And I have enemies." He turned and walked toward the kitchen, his spurs jingling with a deadly, rhythmic chime. "Supper is at sundown. If you can cook, do it. If not, there's hardtack in the pantry." Mylin carried her bag up the narrow, creaking staircase. Her room was freezing, the window rattling in its frame. There was a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a layer of dust so thick she could write her name in it. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs shrieking, and pulled her red scarf tighter. This was her life now. A house of guns and ghosts, children who hated her, and a master who looked at the world down the barrel of a Colt 45. She closed her eyes and exhaled a plume of white mist. She would not cry. She had survived the journey across the ocean, she would survive the winter in this house of wolves. The first week was a war of attrition. The enemy was not just the children, but the filth and the bitter cold. The house had clearly not known a woman's touch, or anyone's care, since Jericho's wife had died 3 years prior. The windows were grime-streaked, the floors sticky with unknown substances, and the pantry was a chaotic mess of spilled flour and dried beans. Mylin rose before the sun every morning. The first battle was the cast-iron stove, a temperamental beast that required coaxing and just the right amount of kindling to roar to life. By the time the children trudged downstairs, the kitchen was warm, though the breakfast she offered was met with suspicion. She made kanji, rice porridge, using the meager supplies she found, seasoning it with dried scallions and ginger she had brought in her bag. "It looks like slop," Tate announced on the 3rd morning, poking the bowl. "It is warm and fills the belly," Mylin said calmly, scrubbing a pot. "Eat." Cassidy pushed her bowl away. "My pa eats steak and beans. We don't eat. Whatever this is." "Then you will be hungry until supper," Mylin replied, not turning around. Jericho entered then, bringing with him a gust of snow and the scent of horses. He looked at the untouched bowls, then at Mylin's straight back. He sat down, picked up a spoon, and ate the porridge in silence. He didn't praise it, but he scraped the bowl clean. The children, watching their father, begrudgingly picked up their spoons. The work was grueling. Mylin's hands, once smooth, became chapped and raw from the scrubbing and the cold water. She found Jericho's shirts, stiff with sweat and dirt, and boiled them until the water turned black. She swept the floors until her shoulders burned. But the hardest part was the atmosphere of the house. Jericho was a ghost in his own home. He spent his days patrolling the perimeter of the ranch, his hand always hovering near his gun. He chopped wood with a violence that suggested he was trying to kill the logs. At night, he sat in the oversized armchair facing the front door, a rifle across his lap, staring into the dark. The children were wild things. Tate disappeared into the barn for hours, climbing the rafters and risking his neck. Ivy was silent, a mute observer who communicated only through tugs on my Lynn's sleeve. Cassidy was the aggressor. She set traps, a bucket of ice water propped over a door, salt in the sugar jar. My Lynn bore it all with a stoic grace that seemed to infuriate the girl. When the bucket fell, soaking my Lynn's cheongsam in freezing water, she didn't scream. She simply dried herself off, changed, and handed Cassidy a mop. "You made the mess," my Lynn said. "You clean it." Cassidy had stared, stunned by the authority in the small woman's voice, and surprisingly, she had mopped. It was on the 6th day that the dynamic shifted. My Lynn was in the barn, gathering eggs from the few scrawny chickens that remained. The barn was dim, shafts of winter light piercing the gloom. She heard the soft click of a hammer being pulled back. She froze. Slowly, she turned. Jericho was at the other end of the barn, practicing his draw. It was a blur of motion, fast, terrifyingly precise. He drew, aimed at a knot in the wood, and reholstered in a heartbeat. He did it again and again, a dance of death. He wasn't shooting, just drilling the muscle memory. He stopped when he sensed her. He didn't turn, but his posture stiffened. "You shouldn't sneak up on a man." "I am not sneaking. I am working," my Lynn said, holding up the basket of eggs. Jericho turned, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "You haven't run off yet." "I have nowhere to go." Most would have started walking anyway. "The kids. They aren't easy." Cassidy has teeth. She is protecting her territory. It is natural. She is the alpha wolf while you are away. Jericho let out a short, humorless laugh. "Alpha wolf? Yeah. I suppose she is." He walked closer, the straw rustling under his heavy boots. "Why do you stay, my Lynn? You could find work in town. A laundry, maybe. Safer than here." "Town does not want me," she said simply. "And here? The roof leaks, the children are angry, and you are afraid." Jericho's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I ain't afraid of nothing." "You are afraid of the silence," she challenged, her voice soft but steady. "That is why you clean your gun 3 times a night. That is why you do not sleep." He took a step closer, towering over her. For a moment, she thought he might strike her or throw her out. The air crackled with tension. "You see a lot for someone who barely speaks." "I see what is there." He stared at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the red scarf, the determined set of her jaw, the way she didn't flinch despite his looming presence. "Get the eggs inside," he muttered, turning away. "Storm's picking up." The storm did pick up. By the second week, the snow was waist deep. The ranch was an island in a sea of white. It was then that the trouble came, not from the weather, but from the town. Supplies were low. Despite the risk, they had to go to Crestwood. Jericho hitched the horses to the wagon. My Lynn insisted on coming. "I need spices. And fabric. The children need clothes that fit." Jericho grunted but didn't argue. He loaded Tate and Ivy into the back, Cassidy rode shotgun next to him, and my Lynn sat on the edge of the bed. Crestwood was a collection of grey buildings huddled against the cold. As the wagon rolled down the main street, silence followed them. Men stopped on the boardwalks to stare. Women pulled their shawls tighter and whispered behind their hands. They looked at Jericho with fear, and at my Lynn with disgust. "Look at that," a voice called out from the front of the saloon. The killer Thorne brought himself a china doll. Jericho's jaw tightened, the muscles jumping. He kept his eyes forward. "Hey! I'm talking to you, Thorne." It was a man with a greasy coat and a scar running through his eyebrow. He stepped into the muddy street, flanked by 2 others. "We don't take kindly to your type bringing foreign trash into our town." Jericho stopped the wagon. He handed the reins to Cassidy. "Stay here. No, My Lin said. She climbed down before Jericho could stop her. Get back in the wagon, Jericho hissed. My Lin ignored him. She walked toward the general store, passing the men. The leader stepped in her path. I didn't say you could pass, doll. He reached out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch the silk of her sleeve, Jericho was there. It happened so fast no one saw him move. One moment he was by the wagon, the next the barrel of his Colt was pressed under the man's chin. Touch her, Jericho said, his voice a low, terrible whisper, and they'll be scrubbing your brains off the street for a week. The man froze, his eyes crossing as he looked down at the gun. The street held its breath. This was the gunslinger. The legend. She's with me, Jericho announced to the town at large. Anyone has a problem with her, they have a problem with me. He shoved the man backward into the mud. My Lin. Get your supplies. My Lin walked past the trembling men, her head high. She bought her flour, her fabric, and a small bag of rock candy. When she returned, Jericho was still standing guard, his hand resting on his gun. On the ride home, the silence was different. It wasn't heavy with resentment, it was thick with unanswered questions. Cassidy looked back at My Lin. You weren't scared. I was terrified, My Lin admitted. You didn't look it. Fear is useless if it stops you from moving, My Lin said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the rock candy. She broke off a piece and handed it to Cassidy. Then one for Tate, and one for Ivy. Cassidy hesitated, then took the amber sugar. She popped it into her mouth. Thanks, she mumbled. Jericho glanced over his shoulder. He caught My Lin's eye. He nodded, a microscopic dip of his chin. It was the most communication they'd had in days. But the thaw in the house was met with a deep freeze outside. February brought a cold that snapped trees in half. And with the cold came the fever. It started with Tate. He woke in the night screaming, his body burning up. By morning, he was delirious. Jericho was frantic. The stoic gunslinger vanished, replaced by a terrified father pacing the floorboards. I have to go for the doc, Jericho said, pulling on his coat. You cannot, My Lin said, looking out the window. The pass is blocked. You will die in the drifts, and the doctor will not come. I can't just watch him die. Jericho roared, slamming his fist against the wall. He will not die, My Lin said firmly. I will treat him. You? You're not a doctor. I know the herbs. I know the fever. She went to her trunk and pulled out a stash of dried roots and leaves she had guarded jealously. For 3 days and nights, the battle raged. My Lin barely slept. She brewed bitter teas that smelled of earth and medicine. She made poultices for Tate's chest. She forced fluids down his throat drop by drop. Jericho sat by the bed, holding his son's hand, his face grey with exhaustion. He watched My Lin work with a kind of awe. She was tireless. She was gentle but firm. When Tate thrashed, she held him down. When he cried, she hummed a melody from her homeland, a song that sounded like rain on a river. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Tate opened his eyes, weak but lucid. Pa, he croaked. Jericho let out a sob that sounded like a rib cracking. He buried his face in the mattress. My Lin stepped back, leaning against the doorframe, her legs trembling from fatigue. Cassidy walked up to her. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed. She reached out and awkwardly took My Lin's hand. You saved him. He is strong, My Lin whispered. No, Cassidy said fiercely. You saved him. That night, after the children were asleep, Jericho found My Lin on the porch. The storm had passed, leaving the world silent and silver under a full moon. You should be sleeping, he said. The air helps me think, she replied. He stood beside her, the heat of his body radiating in the cold air. I misjudged you, My Lin. I thought you were fragile. I am small. It is not the same thing. He chuckled, a genuine sound this time. No. It ain't. He turned to face her, leaning his hip against the railing. Why did you come here? Really? My father died. His debts were passed to me. I was sold to the broker to pay them. This was the assignment. Jericho's face darkened. You were sold. It is common. Not here, he growled. Not in my house. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. It clinked with gold coins. This covers your contract. And your passage back. Anywhere you want to go. San Francisco. China. You're free. Mylin looked at the pouch. It was freedom. It was everything she had thought she wanted when she stepped off that wagon. She looked at the pouch, then at the barn that still needed painting, the fence that needed mending. She thought of Tate's weak smile, Ivy's silent trust, and the way Cassidy had held her hand. She looked up at Jericho. The hard lines of his face had softened. His eyes were no longer flint, they were just the eyes of a man who was lonely and tired of fighting the world alone. I do not want to go to San Francisco, she said. Why not? Because the work here is not done. Mylin. And she stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. I have found that I do not mind the wolves so much. When they are on my side. Jericho stared at her, the pouch hanging forgotten in his hand. The distance between them seemed to vanish. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the silk of her sleeve, then moving to touch the red scarf at her neck. I ain't a good man, Mylin. I've done things. Things that would make you run if you knew.